And we also see the effect of the apostasy as they drift away, how initially it is that they are dominated and oppressed by enemies, by their neighbors, by the Canaanites. And each time when they cry out to God, God is long suffering and he actually answers, raises up a deliverer, a judge for them. But with the passage of time and as this uh, gap between God and Israel widens, so much so that Israel does not even seem to recognize the kingship of the Lord, we see Israel begin to crumble internally too. It's no longer that their enemies are outside, they are their own enemies, and their enemies are within. We see as a sign of that in the story of Samson, we saw how betrayal happens when Samson is betrayed to the Philistines by the tribe of Judah. We saw how Micah was betrayed by the Levite whom he appointed as a priest and by the Danites. Now, this is not to hold Micah up as a paragon of virtue, but just to understand the relationships, how they were just getting strained within the brethren, within Israel. We saw how even the Levites were supposed to be a set apart tribe for priestly duties, was not above rebellion and apostasy. And we even saw how one of the tribes, the tribe of Dan in chapter 13, has publicly instituted idol worship. Till now, it was more secret, personal, family shrines, but Dan goes a step further, the tribe of Dan. And in this chapter, we will see how the morality of the Benjaminites come to the fore. And from 19 onwards, it's a saga of how there is war between the tribes. So much so that even one of the tribes, the tribe of Benjamin, almost gets eliminated. So that's the background. And specifically focusing, if you have to just do a quick bird's eye view of what we're going to study today, I think the first thing we should do is take a step back to 18 and just look at the progression of what happens in 18. So in 18, verse 1 sets up the context. And the context is that in those days, Israel had no king. We saw that. It meant that it's not that they did not have a king, they did not recognize God as their king. Okay. And we saw the consequence of that. So Judges 18:1, to talk about the consequence of that, says Israel in those days had no king. And in those days, the Danite tribe were looking for a new place to settle. Right. And the Danites had a choice to make. We saw how after the spies go back and tell them about Laish, how they decide to go and occupy that place. And then they are confronted with the choice when the entire Dan tribe, not the entire, the tribe that wants to relocate, is heading towards this place. They stop at Micah's house. And the spies who had earlier been in that place actually report. They tell the kinsmen, do you realize that inside this house, Micah's house, there is an ephod? There are some personal idols, there's a carved image and a metal image. Now decide what you want to do. We didn't dwell on that question last time, but that's a significant question. And the question, what are the choices? One is, by the Mosaic tradition, they knew that what Micah was doing was, and the Levite was doing was absolutely wrong. So there was this choice. Do we hearken to what Moses told us about idol worship? And do we respond to that? But you know what the choice was that they took? They decide to break into Micah's house and steal the idol, steal the image, and even hijack the priest, right? And what was the consequence of that? That the Danites now, they stole what Micah had made and they set up their own temple to the idol, right? And they even institute a priesthood that through that Levite whom they hijacked, right? And so we saw this tribe of Dan in chapter 18 by the virtue of the choices they had made. And all of this is in the context of Israel no longer recognizing God as their king. So they actually are the first tribe to head out into institutionalized idol worship, right? And we will see that in chapter 19, 20, and 21, you have the same context. The pattern repeats. So the author is actually telling us there is more that happens when you do not have a king. And there's more that happened to Israel. So he says in 19:1, it starts off with, in those days, Israel had no king. And a Levite living in the remote region of Ephraim went to Bethlehem to reconcile with his concubine. I have actually just condensed it and rephrased it in my own words. So the consequences, what are the consequences that we're going to explore of not having a king? the consequences in this chapter we see are insincere relationships. We see hostility instead of hospitality. We see sexual assault, breakdown of morality. There is sexual assault, there's murder, there is vengeance. So leading to the choice. And at the end of this chapter, we see Israel is again presented. And for the first time, the entire nation of Israel is presented with a choice again. Like the tribe of Dan was present with the choice in chapter 18. And that choice is nothing like this has happened or witnessed before, ever since we left the land of Egypt. Remember, they left the land of Egypt under the kingship of Israel, of the Lord. And they're not realizing that. And they decide that they have to take careful note of this. We cannot ignore this. We must speak about this, and we must decide what we should do. The next week, we will look at what they did. But this week, let us study what happened in between, which led to them having to make this choice. Okay? So, the first part of the story, we have three main characters and one main city that we should focus on. The characters are there's this Levite, his concubine, and the concubine's father. So the word concubine in the Near Eastern societies represents a, a second-class wife, if I may use that word. It's a wife of a lower status. So it's usually a slave. The legitimate wife, normally by tradition, a bride price would have been paid for her, and she has a status which is on par with her husband. Though the husband is the head of the household, it's a patriarchal society. But the concubine had no such freedom. She was not a free woman. She was usually a slave to the master. Okay. And she was deemed as the legal property of the master. This does not mean that there was no relationship of love, but there was a certain distance in that relationship that the woman could not cross a certain boundary, the concubine. So she had a higher status than a mere slave. The sexual relationship that she would have with her master was legitimate, and her children would even be entitled to inherit property on equal terms with the children of the free wife. So it is a relationship, it's not just a convenient sexual relationship. There was a certain legitimacy to it. And it was a legitimacy given by the community, not by the scripture. Because when we read much later, and when we read what Jesus had to say about marriage, we know that God always saw marriage as one man, one woman, right? So, in this context, we see this woman, this Levite woman, has gone back. I'm sorry, the concubine has gone back to her father, and the Levite, after a period of time, wants to go and get her back home. We will explore, if you read that passage, there are hints as to why she went back. And there's an interesting narrative of the encounter between the concubine's father and the Levite. So the question is, in this part, if you look at it carefully, what can we study and see about the relationship between the Levite, his concubine, and his father-in-law? Okay, it's important to understand this relationship because it has a bearing on the entire chapter and what we can learn from it. So that's the first question for us to think about. Okay, so yeah, I think all of the observations that are made are very true. Some versions of the Bible tell us that she left him out of anger. Some say because she played the harlot, and some say she was unfaithful to him. Both are perhaps true. We do not know what the situation was. There must have been some trigger for her to leave. Whether and in those society, in those days, leaving your husband would be considered as playing the harlot, being unfaithful, right? So either version, any of these versions would be true. From what I understand, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scripture, chooses to use the word left him out of anger, whereas the Hebrew translations always say she was unfaithful. But then socially, like we said, it would be deemed unfaithful for a woman to leave her husband and go back to her father's house. So question is, when you look at the relationship between the Levite and the concubine, did he really care for her? Like Santosh said, it does not, here it appears to be that, because after 4 months, he's making an attempt at reconciliation, because we see that she left him because of, she was angry with him. And here he's trying to patch up. So there seems to be, at least from here, there is a remnant or there is some love. And he's trying to attempt reconciliation, get her back home. And so he's going there prepared to do all that it takes to get her back. And why do I say that? Because he goes with 2 donkeys, one for her, one for him, to ride back, right? So he's going with that expectation that he'll bring her back. And we see that in verse 3, when he gets there, that's a concubine, brings him into her father's house. And his father-in-law, greets him warmly. So she was also there, seemed to have some attachment, and she's actually bringing him in. And his father and her father is obviously very relieved that he's there, that the Levite is planning to take her back, and he's very hospitable, right? And he welcomes him, wines and dines him. And in all the references in this portion, 1 to 10, we see the references are all referring to a legitimate husband-wife relationship. He is referred to as her husband in verse 3. The way she brings him to her father's house, and he is referred to as a son-in-law. The concubine's father is referred to as a father-in-law. So everything at this level seems to be a very legitimate husband-wife relationship, right? When we look at between the Levite and the concubine's father, one to notice, they specifically called out that he lived in Bethlehem, which is the city occupied by the tribe of Judah. He greets his Levite son-in-law warmly. He shows great hospitality, concern, and care for his son-in-law's welfare. Like, he coaxes him to stay longer than he planned to. And then he provides all his needs. He provides him food, drink, and he also demonstrates great concern for their safety when they're traveling back. On the 5th day, when the Levite decides that he is going back today, the father-in-law tries to tell him, why don't you leave tomorrow? Because it's already half the day is over. You have a long way to travel, and it's probably not safe. So we can read into that probably a sense of concern about their safety also, right? So combine this, just remember that he lives in Bethlehem, because there is some kind of a significance as a foreshadowing of something else here, the fact that he was in Bethlehem. So that's as much as we can gauge at this first level of the relationships between the Levite, his concubine, and the father-in-law. Which brings us to the second question. So now they head back, and I think it's supposed to be about 4 hours travel. And in between, there's the city of Jebus, which is still occupied by the Jebusites, and the Jebusites are a Canaanite tribe. And the Levite decides that it's not safe, probably. We'll just go on until we reach a Canaanite city. So they press on until they come to Gibeah. In that society, in the Near Eastern society, hospitality for strangers is very, very important, right? It was very shameful in the community if there was a traveling stranger who was sleeping in the city square. So that's the context in which we come to our next question, verses 11 to 21. What can we understand, given this context, what can we understand of the reputation and social conditions of Bethlehem? So just remember what happened in Bethlehem, how the Levite was treated, why he did not stop at Jebus, and what happens when he reaches Gibeah, which is the place he chooses to halt, because it is a city occupied by the Benjaminite tribe, his brethren. So that's our second question. So let's just look at these 3 cities, right? Bethlehem we already looked at, right? It is represented by the father-in-law. It is a city occupied by the tribe of Judah, and it represents, because of what we're told of the concubine's father, it represents warmth, love, care, hospitality, everything that was hallmarks of a good society in those times and in that area. And the concubine's father is a demonstration of all of that. Jebus, we only know of it by what the Levite's perception of the city was. He saw it as an alien Canaanite city, and he assumes that it is probably unfriendly to the Israelites, and he cannot expect safety or hospitality there. So though his slave seems to say we could stop there, probably, I don't know, he thought there was an inn there where they could stay or whatever. He says that let's push on. Let's go to Gibeah, where we are sure to be safe, where we are sure to get a roof over our head. Remember, in those days, we are talking about a time when there weren't all these inns and hotels and all of that, right? So they push on to Gibeah, or Gibeah, I don't know the exact pronunciation. I'll just continue to say Gibeah. This is The Levite knows it's an Israelite city and it's occupied by the Benjaminites. His expectation is to be safe among his brethren, that he would find provision and hospitality there. However, what we see is a lack of warmth. Right up front, we are told that the general population has not responded to this traveling stranger sitting in the city square. Normally, you would, in those days, like if someone's sitting in the city square, somebody would come up and ask them, where are you going to? Where are you from? Why don't you come and stay with me and partake of my meal and then spend your night there? He would wash his feet, wash the dust of the traveling stranger's feet, and give him a bed to sleep on. That was the expectation. None of that proved to be true. So we are beginning to understand a little more about what the author means when he says in those days Israel had no king, right? Subsequently, we also experience that it is not just the coldness of the population, there is also hostility under the covers. For all we know, we are not told, they might have experienced some amount of hostility while they were in the city square itself. And um, so that's what we are yet to see. But we see one person in the city, just one person, who's actually not a Benjaminite. He's an Ephraimite who's actually there as probably he's there as a tenant farmer or something like that. He's a farmer. He sees them and he welcomes them to his home. We are told that the Levite was wealthy enough. He had his own provision. He did not need anything except a roof over his head. But the Ephraimite, in true hospitality tradition, he actually tells him, don't worry, come stay with me, enjoy yourself, I'll provide you with food and shelter and all of that. So that's the picture we get of these three cities, right? In Bethlehem, you have what you expect. In Jebus, you're expecting something we do not know what it was like. In Gibeah, you have a broken down society that that is not like what the Levite or we would expect to see. Why is this? What's the significance, Bethlehem and Gibeah or Gibeah? I think Bethlehem and Gibeah foreshadows the kingship of David and Saul in the future. When you move to Samuel, we will see that the first king of Israel actually comes from Gibeah. That is Saul's city. And he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And the second king is King David. He comes from Bethlehem and he's from the tribe of Judah, right? And we'll see the similar kind of thing, this cutting up of animals into pieces and sending them as a message to all of Israel as a tribe, as a message that they have to come together to attack the enemy. Saul also does the same thing later. So there is a sort of foreshadowing of this play that's going to happen between Bethlehem and Gibeah in the future, in this particular incident. Probably that's why the author chose this incident also, to demonstrate what happens when there is no authority, when Israel does not recognize the kingship of the Lord. Okay. So with that, we'll move on to the next question, which is the tough part, right? Verse 22 to 26. So we see how some of the people of the city actually come banging on the door of this Ephraimite. So word has got around that there is a stranger in their city, and they want to sexually assault him. And we are looking at homosexual assault, right? And the Ephraimite actually offers his virgin daughter and the concubine as a trade-off. He says, like, don't assault this guest of mine, but take them instead. And then what transpires is very, very disturbing after that, right? So 22 to 26 uh, uh, gives us that portion, uh, description of that portion. From that, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what can we understand about the behavior of the old Ephraimite farmer and the Levite? What were their value systems? What was important to them? How did they measure what was considered disgraceful and wicked, right? And how does it compare? So if anyone has read this, you will immediately begin to think that somebody has transported the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, edited it, and pushed it in here also. It's the same chapter number also, coincidentally, right? So how does what happens here in Gibeah compare with what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? And that's a story of Lot, Abraham and Lot. So that's a question for us, right? The behavior, how do we understand the value system, the behavior of the Ephraimite and the Levite? What do they consider as disgraceful and wicked? And how does it compare with what happened earlier in history in Sodom and Gomorrah? So let's look at this portion in a little more depth, right? First thing to note is that in this case, it is some worthless men, some no-gooders in some of the Bible. It's not all the people of the city, right, who come and bang on the door, right? It just says some good for nothings. In some Bibles, it says they were the sons of Belial. And homosexual rape, we can see, was considered relatively more horrific, wicked, and disgraceful than the rape of a woman. It is not that the rape of a woman was accepted, because we know from other portions of scripture earlier also, as well as the laws, the Deuteronomic laws, the laws in Exodus, as well as in Numbers, that rape of a woman was an adultery, was considered a violation of God's commandments, right? It was not okay. But here we see morality is subjective, it has become relative. And that's the problem here, right? When there is no reference, when you lose your, we discussed that last time also. And we will look at that a little more towards the end of the study also. What happens and why does the author has used that refrain? In those days, Israel had no king, is because they were choosing their own morality now. And then we have all of these issues, right? You choose between the relatively lesser evil, or so what you think, right? The old Ephraimites' concerns were to protect the honor of a man, right? He was not so much concerned that it was a Levite, but he was concerned about protecting the honor of a man who was also his guest, right? And when pressed, he was willing to make a relative moral choice. He was willing to sacrifice woman's honor and body to save the man's honor and body. So when Suma was saying that, how could they have done this? We are in a society today where it's not the same, right? There is more. Also, remember, we are in a. We'll discuss a little this one. Perceptions of the relative value of man and woman is different in the times that we are reading about then and today. And so for us, it is always going to be shocking. The very fact that he could offer his daughter in place to save the honor of a stranger who was living with him. But in the conditioning of the society at that time, that this was a valid choice that he could make, and he chose that. Whether it's right or wrong, we will look at that a little further, right? When we get into a latter part of the study. So just hold that thought for some time. The Levite, when we look at the Levite, what does he do? When his host's negotiations fail, so he's probably eagerly listening to what is happening. Am I safe? When he realizes that this is not going to work, that my skin is at risk, he grabs his concubine, we are told, and he forces her out of the house to be raped. He knows clearly what's going to happen to her, and he throws her to the wolves, right? For him, self-preservation comes to the fore, and all that veneer of care and concern for his concubine that we saw in the first 10 verses, it just falls off. So that was a thin veneer over the instinct to preserve himself, right? So, and the author also calls our attention to that, because in verse 26 to 27, we'll see a shift. The reference to the relationship between the Levite and the concubine is no longer now husband, son-in-law, father-in-law, that marriage relationship, husband and wife, but she is now referred to as a concubine, and he is referred relatively as her master. So it has now shifted from a master and his property, right? So that's what the author is trying to tell us, right? So that relationship that we thought we saw earlier was just a thin veneer, and it has fallen off. Deep down, he just sees her as his property, and he had gone there to claim his property. So comparison between Sodom and Gomorrah. So it is impossible, like I said, to ignore the parallels, but there are some significant differences. Lot offers hospitality to the male angelic visitors in Sodom, similar to the Ephraimite here. There is total wickedness in the city, Sodom, as well as in Gibeah. But remember, in Sodom, it was absolute. All the men, if you read that portion, it is told that all the men, both the young and the old, from every part of the city, surround Sodom. and they demand that the visitors be sent out for them to sexually assault them. But here we are told only a few of the lawless element of Gibeah are the assaulters. So one difference there. Next is Lot makes a choice, right? He offers, take my virgin daughters, spare these men who are my guests. Very similar to the choice that Ephraim makes. So in his society, so we see that he's adopting the value system of the society. So Sodom is a city, it is the region which is now known as Canaan, right? In Abraham and Lot's time, it was Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the same region that's now known as Canaan, right? And so Lot has adopted the value system of the community that he is living in. Remember, he made a choice to go and live there. Then Lot is protected, however, from his choice. The assaulters are struck with blindness. The Levites pull Lot back into the house and they strike all the assaulters with blindness. And then they ask Lot and his family to leave the city. Whereas here, the Levite, the man under threat, is throwing his concubine to the assaulters and then goes to bed in safety. Right? It's very striking when we notice that the woman comes back after she's assaulted and she comes back and she's lying at the closed door, outside the closed door. The next morning is reaction. We are told that he woke up the next morning and decides to resume his journey. So obviously, he slept through this night, right? And the entire city and all its inhabitants, with the exception of Lot, in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, are destroyed. Only Lot and his family are rescued from the act of judgment by God. So God visits his judgment on the city. Whereas in the case of Gibeah, the tribe of Benjamin is almost entirely destroyed as an act of vengeance. Now it is, there it was God's judgment. Here it is an act of vengeance and misplaced justice by the same brethren, by the other tribes. And that's what we'll study next time, right? So this comparison has some differences. And from this difference, what we can see is Israel is, in these days, Israel had no king. And Israel had now become like the Canaanites, right? Sodom, they have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. They have become like the Canaanites. So that's how far they have drifted away. Which leads us to the next question.
Hey, Sushil.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can go back to that previous screen now.
Mm-hmm.
On the second point, I mean, I have a question on the second point on that because, yeah, there were only few lawless people, few people were banging the door. But my question is because the city had also become complicit because they knew something bad was happening. Nobody tried to prevent what do you call that? Those lawless men. Second is like as you said, like when you read this, the war, what happens? The Israel comes and demands for these men, and Benjamin refuses to give it to them.
That's true.
Yeah, so that means that city also has become complicit. May not be lawless, but they are complicit, right?
Yeah. So the city has demonstrated coldness, as we already saw. But this total wickedness, this sexual depravity, we are told specifically that a few of them were there. And later, we will see when you look at how the Levite tries to rouse up the anger of the rest of Israel, how he chooses to paint the picture. So I think it is important to note here that because that also tells us a little bit about how Israel is responding to these kind of things now. Like in the case of Dan, remember Israel was supposed to take over Canaan, but in the case of Dan, when they take over Laish, we are drawn to attention is drawn multiple times to the fact that the people of Laish were defenseless, right? They were not expecting to be assaulted. They were defenseless, yes, they were slaughtered. Likewise here, I think it is important that there are a few. I'm not saying that Gibeah in totality did not have a collective responsibility. They did. They did not answer for that. But I think there is an importance to the fact that it was a few people here who were demonstrating this wickedness. And we'll just look at that. When we get a little later down, we'll understand why I was saying this, okay?
Sushil, can I just add to
Sure,
that?
Sujit, yeah.
Yeah, so I think part of the lesson here, at least from what I see from this whole story, is more than or at least as significant as the sins of those wicked few, the significance is of the sins of omission by the people involved. They had an opportunity to take care of these guests. they were uh, they didn't respond, and because of that, they became the guests
Vulnerable,
became
yeah.
vulnerable to a more volatile situation.
Hmm.
I think there is a huge learning here, right? So, right from the beginning of this passage, to if you look at the Levite, the way he's mentioned, it starts with that he's from a remote country, right? Why is that even mentioned, right? So, oftentimes we think that we as insignificant people have no play in history, but you realize that this one person from a remote part of this country is actually resulting in a churn for the entire nation,
Hmm.
right? So that one calls out to that every little part, every little person in the country can be a significant player in the history of the nation too. I think the challenge for us, especially as Christians, is we often focus on our what Achin calls personal faith, and we are often oblivious to our role in society to be protective of those who are vulnerable. We are
That's
too
true.
focused on our own state, that we don't pay attention enough to our opportunities to prepare people who are, if we don't act, would end up in more volatile situations, right? And
Absolutely.
that to me is significant, because these are not Canaanite tribes, these are people of Israel. They are chosen by God, so there is an expectation of them to act a certain way. They didn't, and then you see the things turning from bad to worse. So to me, while we can look at the sins of the wicked and how bad they are, I think the real starting point, much like the story of the Samaritan, that we study, a good Samaritan, is there are opportunities for people to act, and it's the question of how bad does it get and who acts, that that results in the end of the a good or a bad ending to the story. So to us, I think while we can look at it as one of the worst in terms of violence, I think there is also a learning for us whether we are acting in the opportunities that are given to us.
Absolutely. I- Yeah, I totally agree. And thanks for drawing out some of that, the wider perspective of how there is a collective falling away, there's a collective failing, which results in the significant wickedness that we see here. Very true. Thank you, Sudhir. So the next question is, when we look at the Levite, if we had to read a little into the next chapter also, what do you think about the Levite's choice? Okay, so just remember that always we are in the context of the author telling us that refrain has to echo in our head. In those days, Israel had no king, and it's referring to. He doesn't say that the town of Gibeah did not have a king, Micah did not have a king. It is symptomatic of entire Israel for sure, as much as it is symptomatic of Benjamin. And we will see that here in when we look at how the Levite progresses into the next, how he escalates into the next level. So, what do you think about the actions and conduct of the Levite towards his molested concubine? What do you think he was trying to achieve? Compare what actually happened to what he did and to what he said happened, as we read in the early verses of chapter 20. And that's the next question for us. So, yeah, so when you look at this portion, like all of you have observed, and Santosh has said also, so we saw that shift, right? The Levite is now referred to as the master of the concubine. The relationship has moved from a husband-wife kind of relationship to an owner-property kind of a relationship. What happened is he forces her out against out against her will, and he goes to bed in safety. The next day, when he's beginning his journey, it appears like he was even ready to start off without her, because you see, suddenly he sees her. We are told, right? He's getting up and he's getting ready to go, and then he sees her, and then he curtly tells her, "Get up, let's go." He does not seem to care whether she's dead or almost dead. And he doesn't even seem to care whether she will die en route. What is the current situation? He just puts on the donkey and he heads out. His primary drive now is that his property is defiled and his honor has been violated, right? And so we see that what he does is such a graphic message that he sends out to the tribes, a message that cannot be ignored, when he chops up the concubine and sends her to all the tribes. So it's a symbolic act by which the crime committed was placed before the eyes of the entire nation to summon it to punish the crime. And he gives his version of the events, like Santosh was saying. He implies that it was all their fault, right? And he does not. He says the citizens of Gibeah. So he's seeing no differentiation. He's holding the entire city to blame, right? And then he wants a sweeping revenge. He protects his own honor. He does not reveal that they wanted to assault him, but he sacrifices concubine rather than protect her. He makes it look like he was overpowered. So from this, we see that in the story, we are seeing a story of love and hate, love manifesting itself as hospitality, hate manifesting as immorality. And we understand why we are told that there was no king and man is setting his own standards. Just like in Genesis 3:5, the choice offered to Adam and Eve, Satan tells them, when you make this choice, your eyes will open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So you can make the choices. And that's the big temptation, right? So when God is not king anymore in your life, when God is king, he sets the standards. Ephesians 5:25 tells us, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her to sanctify her. He had to present her as a holy and blameless sacrifice, right? He had to present her holy and blameless to the Lord. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives with their own bodies. So Christ to the church, Christ is modeling the relationship that you should have, actually, rather than what we saw here. So to the church, he was a prophet. He, as a husband and wife. So there is some relevance at a husband and wife level itself, which I was just trying to bring out here. There's also a larger relevance of what happens when you do not recognize God as your king, and when you begin to choose and set your own standards of good and bad, right? So Christ as a church, he was a prophet, a priest, and a king. And that's what a husband has to be to the wife also in a husband-wife relationship. A prophet has the role of teaching and discerning the word of God. As a priest, you are an intercessor and a prayer leader. And as a king, you have the responsibility to clearly lead with the responsibility to provide and protect, right? And we know what Christ did to demonstrate his love for the church, right? He gave up his life for her. So it brings us to this last question. This is a chapter that disturbs anybody who reads it. What is it that disturbs you most about this chapter? A lot of what Sujit said is what I would like to focus on in this question. And this is our breakout question. Is this a portion that is relevant to our circumstance in India in these days? Like the chapter says, in those days, Israel had no king, and this is what happened. Is it relevant to our circumstance today? As a Christian family, what should we take careful note of? Remember, the Levite presented this dismembered body to the rest of Israel. And when they gathered together, they said, nothing like this has happened before. From the time we left Egypt, we should take careful note of this, discuss it, and speak. This is just like the choice that last time we saw Dan, the tribe of Dan had, when they came to know that Micah's house had idols. We know what they chose to do. Likewise, the Israelites have a choice. We'll study what they did next time. We also have a choice in these days. As a Christian family, what should we take careful note of? What should we discuss about? What should we speak about? What should we act about? And how should we act? That's our breakout question. I think this chapter is very relevant, right? It holds up a mirror to what we are today and what's happening around us. But it's a tough question to ask. Christ actually crystallizes the center of the problem. He says it's a problem that's it's a heart trouble. It's a heart disease that we all have, because from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, fornication, theft, and everything else. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a man. And Paul had the solution. He said you need heart surgery. And what did he say? We preach Christ crucified to the Jews, a stumbling block to the Greeks. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So The power of God and the wisdom of God is the solution. And it is only through the crucified Christ that we can experience that, right? And Matthew 25, when Jesus talks about what would happen when he comes again, right, in judgment, is a portion that I think is very relevant to this day. If you are asking, what can I do about it? The opportunity is all around us, in your own home, right outside your home. Because on that day, Jesus will tell you, I tell you the truth. Just as you did it for one of the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did it to me. So it's every one of us. The opportunities are there all around us. As a closing thought, behavior is rooted in belief, because the author of belief transforms behavior. That's just the closing thought that I wanted to leave you with.